First off, the United States has sanctioned Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, for her role in undermining Hong Kong's freedom. And President Trump has banned TikTok and Wechat from conducting business in the United States. Also, the Chinese Consulate in New York has been destroying documents on a large scale. We have exclusive footage of this. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. The Department of Treasury has imposed sanctions on Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, and 10 other individuals for, quote, undermining Hong Kong's autonomy and restricting the freedom of expression or assembly of the citizens of Hong Kong. Now, these new sanctions are happening under Trump's executive order on Hong Kong normalization, which he issued back in July, that had already sanctioned CCP officials involved in undermining Hong Kong's freedom and autonomy. But these new sanctions go a step further and directly target top leaders in Hong Kong. Now, the Treasury Department stated that Carrie Lam is, quote, directly responsible for implementing Beijing's policies of suppression of freedom and democratic processes. Secretary of Treasury Steve Mnuchin said, quote, the United States stands with the people of Hong Kong and will use our tools and authorities to target those undermining their autonomy. Now, in addition to this, the Treasury Department actually published the passport numbers and even the home addresses of Carrie Lam and these other officials who've now been sanctioned. This means that their private information, personal identifying information, is now publicly posted for the world to see, which could really impact them, one, if they want to travel and want to use their passports, and two, even within their own countries, now that people know exactly where they live, possibly for protests. Now, this is a major development in the United States taking a stand against the Chinese regime's abuses of its own people, and we'll be following this closely. And in other news, the U.S. ban on TikTok is now going through and will now include a partial ban on Wechat as well. President Donald Trump signed executive orders to ban U.S. companies from transactions with the parent companies of these two Chinese social media apps, that is ByteDance for TikTok and Tencent Holdings for Wechat, respectively, on the grounds of national security concerns. Trump has given TikTok and Wechat 45 days to end their business relationships in the United States.
How? Very simple. I mean, we have all the cards, because without us, you can't come into the United States.
Trump's executive order on Wechat states this, quote, to protect our nation, I took action to address the threat posed by the mobile application TikTok. Further action is needed to address a similar threat posed by another mobile application, Wechat. Now it states this, quote, like TikTok, Wechat automatically captures vast swaths of information from its users. This data collection threatens to allow the Chinese Communist Party access to Americans' personal and proprietary information. In addition, the application captures the personal and proprietary information of Chinese nationals visiting the United States, thereby allowing the Chinese Communist Party a mechanism for keeping tabs on Chinese citizens who may be enjoying the benefits of a free society for the first time in their lives. Now, TikTok denies the accusations that user data in the United States could be sent to China, and it is also now threatening legal action against Trump's executive order. Now, by banning these companies' ability to have business relationships in the United States, very likely we'll see them lose advertising, and very possibly they could be removed from the Apple and Google app stores. In other news, a third flood wave has formed on the Yellow River on the night of August 6. Videos from the ground show heavy rains in Xi'an of Shanxi and mountain torrents in Longnan and Gansu. According to the Yellow River Conservancy Commission website, between August 4th and August 6th, heavy rains led to peak discharge of the Yellow River of around 16,600 cubic feet per second. In other news, floods are continuing also along the Yangtze River, and satellite images are now showing that Chinese cities are flooded by the waters. And in other news, the top 7 CCP officials in the Politburo Standing Committee have again disappeared from the public eye. Reports from Chinese state media show that CCP leader Xi Jinping and another party head Li Keqiang stopped public activities on July 31st. This happens as well as Chinese police have strengthened security checks in public transportation stations in different parts of China. At the same time, the 7 Politburo Standing Committee members have not made any appearances on CCTV since August 1st. Now, the disappearances from public attention have led analysts to speculate the CCP leaders may be holding their Beidaihe meeting secretly. Now, this is being taken in context of the fact that the CCP is struggling both internally and externally, and the power struggles and infighting within the party are fierce. Now, there were reports that top CCP officials have conspired to hold Xi Jinping accountable during the Beidaihe meeting, but it is still unpredictable what will happen. Now, on this meeting, it has always been regarded as the venue for the CCP elderly members' intervention and is generally held between July and August. This year's Beidaihe meeting also raised attention from the outside world. The CCP is facing unprecedented crisis of domestic and foreign challenges. The United States has gradually tightened its grip on sanctioning the CCP and has gradually formed a unified anti-communist front with the international community. In China, the virus epidemic has continued to spread. Floods, meanwhile, in the south have caused unprecedented economic loss. And as a result, the internal power struggles of the CCP have become more fierce, and Xi Jinping is being attacked from both inside and outside. And now for the broader stories for today. First off, the Chinese regime has an insurgency on its hands that is blocking its ambitions to establish a key route within the One Belt, One Road initiative. This is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor that was aimed to connect Xinjiang with Pakistan's Gwadar port in Balochistan. Now, the problem, however, is that many groups in Balochistan don't regard themselves as being part of Pakistan. And given that they see the CCP's actions as direct incursions on their interests and their territory, they've now united in an insurgency movement against the CCP. Now, just recently, the various separatist groups in Pakistan announced they are forming an alliance to attack Chinese interests in the region, putting a large dent in the CCP's trade agendas at a time when its economy is unstable. Now, in a recent suicide attack by the Balochistan Liberation Army, insurgents targeted the Pakistan Stock Exchange on June 29, killing 4 and losing 4 of their own. And adding to this conflict, Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan is accusing India of being behind the attack, furthering another conflict where the CCP backs Pakistan to also undermine India. Now, following this recent attack, the Chinese Communist Party is pushing Pakistan to also push the United Nations to label the Balochistan Liberation Army as a terrorist organization. But Pakistan has been wary about this, allegedly because it fears that it will internationalize the terrorist group. Now, so what are we seeing here? The Chinese Communist Party's interests are being directly attacked. One of the main ports it wanted to have for the One Belt, One Road initiative connecting to Pakistan just so happens to go through an area that is regarded as a separatist region of Pakistan. And the individuals there have made it their focus to attack Chinese nationals passing through that area. And at the same time this is happening, Pakistan is being used by the Chinese Communist Party in proxy attacks on India. For example, Pakistan was recently exposed as being behind a CCP information war around the India-China border standoff. So it's a complicated situation here. The Chinese Communist Party, if it wants to protect its own interests, would very likely need to get directly involved in these quote-unquote security operations. If it does so, then the Chinese Communist Party is going to be one of the images of the oppression of these different Muslim groups and could also bring in, say, attacks from other terrorist organizations. Now, Pakistan is no stranger when it comes to terrorism. They understand how these groups operate. If this Balochistan Liberation Army is listed as a terrorist organization by the United Nations, then the image of the United Nations getting behind this and, say, going against this group will internationalize the Balochistan Liberation Army among other terrorist organizations, meaning that it may win the support of terrorist groups such as ISIS or others. If that happens, then the Chinese Communist Party becomes the focus of a new terror war, and the Chinese Communist Party would have to deal with that or make Pakistan deal with it for them. If Pakistan has to deal with it, then Pakistan becomes a target of these groups, and they're very unlikely to do that. But if the CCP fails to do anything about it and doesn't protect, say, different convoys heading through this area, trade convoys, then they're going to be attacked by these groups that have very recently united and are focusing specifically on attacking Chinese interests. The CCP has 2 choices at this point. 1, get directly involved in this and become the face of the new terror war, essentially. Or 2, they allow these attacks to continue on their own assets, which will undermine its One Belt, One Road initiative. Meanwhile, the Epoch Times has published an exclusive story finding that the Chinese consulate in New York is destroying documents on a large scale. Around noon on August 6, two shredding trucks from a company called USA Shred were seen parked in front of the gate of the Chinese consulate in New York. Several large plastic buckets of documents were seen at the gate, and company personnel were monitoring the shredding process. An Epoch Times reporter who was on the scene witnessed the shredding taking place for 2 hours before leaving the scene, and during that time the shredding was still ongoing. Local residents living nearby said in interviews that they had never seen before the Chinese consulate hire shredding trucks to destroy documents like this. Typically, consulates will have their own paper shredders inside the buildings, but the pace of these is much slower. The use of these large shredding trucks, rather than the use of these small indoor shredders, suggests that the consulate was willing to risk being seen destroying documents in order to more quickly destroy the documents, again suggesting they were in a hurry. Now, its use of a professional shredding company rather than burning documents like was seen at the Chinese consulate in Houston before it was closed also suggests they were taking some steps to avoid drawing too much attention. Now, the incident takes place following the forced closure of the Chinese consulate in Houston and the closure of the U.S. consulate in Chengdu, China. Questions have been growing as to whether additional consulates will be closed in the U.S. and in China. And now the U.S. consulate in Beijing recently held an auction for furniture and other goods, and now the Chinese consulate in New York is destroying documents. If the Houston closure was about espionage,
and we closed our consulate in Houston because it was a den of spies.
The consulate in New York could easily be closed under the same reasoning. Now, the Chinese ambassador to the United States and a Chinese diplomat in New York was accused by the FBI last year of facilitating the CCP's recruitment of scientists in the United States. Given this finding, China expert Gordon Cheng questioned on Twitter on June 25th, quote, "Why haven't we expelled Cui Tiankai and the other diplomat? And let's close the New York consulate while we're at it." Now, the Epoch Times had also exposed previously how the former Chinese consulate general in New York, Peng Ke-yu, had been involved with United Front operations, including in encouraging violence meant to suppress Chinese dissidents on U.S. soil. Peng Ke-yu was recorded in a phone call admitting his involvement. This was back in 2008. And as this is happening, as the Chinese Communist Party is being locked in border disputes with most of its neighboring countries, and as India and Japan are now paying companies to leave China, the Chinese Communist Party is trying a softer approach when it comes to individual Japanese companies. Nikkei reported that CCP leader Xi Jinping compared the founder of Japanese electronics company Panasonic to Thomas Edison. Soon after, the CCP Vice Minister of Industry and Information Technology recommended that reporters visit the Toyota Motors facilities when they visit Japan, and said they, quote, continually innovate and also raise their product quality. Now, what's happening right now? The Chinese Communist Party is showing its many faces, right? Diplomatically, they're very harsh. They have this wolf warrior diplomacy. When it comes to direct attacks on businesses or threats of sanctions at the political level, they're very aggressive as well. If these countries even criticize the CCP, they will threaten them with economic sanctions, as we recently saw them do, for example, against Australia. But at the same time, when it comes to individual engagement with businesses themselves, not on the political level, the CCP is trying to show another face, this old friendly face, and it's trying to lure them, trying to get them to stay in its country. Now, we saw something similar with the Chinese Communist Party's relations in Australia, where despite this whole diplomatic conflict they have right now, they're still importing iron. Australia, of course, is part of the new Quad alliance, India, Japan, Australia, the United States, challenging the Chinese Communist Party's claims to the South China Sea. At the same time, Australia was calling for investigations into the origin of the novel coronavirus, the CCP virus. Now, the CCP, when that happened, threatened Australia with trade sanctions. But despite all of this, the Chinese Communist Party is still being engaged when it comes to iron imports. And why is that? It's because they need it, just like the Chinese Communist Party needs high-tech manufacturing. These are the multiple faces the Chinese Communist Party is using depending on where their interests are. Now, in other news, the Chinese regime is waging political warfare against Taiwan using 5 main strategies. This is according to a new paper from J. Michael Cole, chief editor of Taiwan Sentinel and a former intelligence officer for the Canadian Security Intelligence Services in Ottawa. Now, he says the first strategy of the Chinese Communist Party when it comes to political warfare focused on Taiwan is to corrode or manipulate the country's institutions, its elections, and public trust. The second is to weaken morale of the people in the country and to manipulate them emotionally in ways that benefit the interests of the CCP. The third is to sow confusion in order to widen divisions in the society. This could be information campaigns, for example. The fourth is to use methods to get elites in the country, the business people, the politicians, retired military officers, civil society, and media personnel working on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. Same types of operations do in other countries as well. And the fifth is to coerce people in Taiwan who may be opposed to the CCP or critical of it into then supporting the agendas of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, Cole states that through these tactics, the CCP has tried to balkanize Taiwanese society, in other words, divide it, and also its political systems. He said this, quote, "This strategy also involves the creation of associations via a multitude of local proxies with counterparts in China linked to the United Front." Other components of China's sharp power, which is the term he's using for political warfare, sharp power, strategy include the co-option of local officials, as well as deploying dis- or misinformation campaigns through traditional, new, and social media to increase polarization, sow confusion, and undermine support for Taiwan's elected government. Now, he notes that the CCP doesn't limit these political warfare tactics to Taiwan. It uses similar models targeting other countries, including Canada and Australia and others. Now, he notes that the situation in Taiwan and how the government there has dealt with the CCP's political warfare, given they're aware of most of these things, could help inform other countries that are facing these same tactics from the Chinese regime. Now, Cole says this, quote, "However, despite mounting evidence of Chinese interference in our affairs," referring to Canada, countries like Canada have been reluctant to adopt laws and implement measures to effectively counter China. Relative newcomers to this game, like Canada, have much to learn about China's sharp power, again the term he's using for political warfare, and the means by which to protect their democratic institutions. Now, when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party and its political warfare operations, or sharp power if you want to call it that, it has many official branches focused on this. On the military side, there's the General Political Department, Liaison Department. This is a branch of the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military, focused on political warfare. Actually, the Liaison Department is even publicly listed on some of the websites of its consulates. The other one on the government side is the United Front Work Department, which the Chinese Communist Party runs through its different consulates again, and even are sometimes publicly listed. The United Front Work Department, through these operations, will basically run a local consulate like a foreign branch of the Chinese Communist Party, like a local government branch. And it will then try to subvert the local community. One of the main targets are the Tongs, these fraternal organizations or front operations. When Cole talked about, for example, these secret societies or different organizations in these communities, that is a reference to the Tongs. There's basically the unofficial governing bodies in a lot of Chinatowns. If the Chinese Communist Party can gain influence over them or direct control over them through the United Front, then the people in charge of the Tongs become the de facto local government officials when it comes to the CCP's operations to spread its influence into these different countries. Now, when it comes to the broader picture of political warfare, this ties to the basic model of Soviet-era ideological subversion tactics. This basically focused on demoralizing a society and corroding that society from within. This would create then the fertile ground for takeover by the Soviets. The Chinese Communist Party have basically taken the Soviet model of ideological subversion, altered it a bit, and created their new methods for front operations and for unrestricted warfare. Now, in other news, the New York Times quietly removed all paid propaganda it had published from the Chinese regime. A spokeswoman from the New York Times told the Washington Free Beacon that, quote, "We made the decision at the beginning of this year to stop accepting branded content ads from state-run media, which includes China Daily." Now, China Daily is a state-run news outlet of the Chinese Communist Party, in fact, one of its main ones in English. It publishes also paid inserts in several legacy news outlets under its, quote, China Watch label. China Daily is a registered foreign agent of the CCP, and more recently was even designated as an official foreign mission of the Chinese government. And that designation means that it's basically regarded as a branch of the government itself. Now, the Free Beacon had previously reported that China Daily failed to disclose required information about its relationships with U.S. news outlets, and the findings suggested it had been violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA, through these relationships and through these advertisements. Now, this led to a group of 35 lawmakers calling for an investigation into China Daily's compliance with U.S. law. Now, afterwards, China Daily released its required financial information, and that information revealed that it had been paying large amounts of money to American news outlets to directly run CCP propaganda. This included more than $100,000 a month to Washington Post and Wall Street Journal, $50,000 in 2018 to the New York Times to run CCP propaganda on its website, and hundreds of thousands of dollars to other news outlets in similar deals, including to the Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, the Houston Chronicle, and others. Meanwhile, YouTube has banned over 2,500 Chinese accounts that it determined were part of a coordinated influence operation. Now, the exact channels were not identified, so it's unclear whether these were actual, say, disinformation programs of the CCP or just Chinese language channels in general. But it noted in a previous move against Chinese influence operations back in April, that was when it deleted 186 channels linked to China. Quote, "These channels mostly uploaded spammy, non-political content, but a small subset posted political content primarily in Chinese, similar to findings in a recent Graphica report, including content related to the U.S. response to COVID-19. And in addition to this, as President Trump has now banned U.S. companies from transactions with TikTok, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is also threatening to put an end to the ability of Chinese tech companies to access U.S. data. This could include a larger ban on Chinese apps overall. Now, what are we seeing across the whole board here when it comes to the different censorship techniques, the state-run propaganda being published in American news outlets, and also Chinese apps using the app market to access data on Americans? Now, in the Chinese Communist Party's phrasing, they would call this the borrowed boat strategy. They talk about using the outlets of other countries, using the quote-unquote boats of other countries in order to access their different audiences or information. When it comes to, for example, publishing these paid inserts in American news outlets, it is manipulating, taking advantage of the established credibility of these different publications and their readerships in order to push Chinese Communist Party propaganda directly to their doorsteps and directly to them, say, on their apps or smartphones and so on. Now, when it comes to disinformation tactics, this is a well-established method. When it comes to the Soviet Union, for example, one of the main methods they had in disinformation was to establish front groups, for example, nonprofit organizations or research organizations in the United States, publish papers on, say, different topics, and to try to get those topics published directly in U.S. news outlets. The idea was this: if they were to publish these things directly in Russian state news outlets, it would be seen as foreign propaganda. But if those same stories were picked up by these different news outlets and used roundabout ways to get them published, then it was seen as legitimate by the many readers of these different publications. And they found something interesting when it came to disinformation using these tactics, which is that the stories would often take on lives of their own within the respective countries. And it does seem that something is now being done about this. When it comes to, for example, the New York Times deleting these different paid articles from the Chinese Communist Party. Now, it was known that it was doing that before. It was taking money from the CCP in order to publish these articles. But also the bigger picture of this is interesting, because now we have Secretary of State Mike Pompeo going after things just like this. And we also see now Google's YouTube taking a much larger stance when it comes to deleting channels that are allegedly tied to Chinese Communist Party information operations. It does appear to be a larger push taking place. Whether these are coordinated, it is not known. But what we can say is that the US government is pushing much harder to crack down on the CCP's use of propaganda in this country, and to also subvert our institutions, using what they would call, again, the borrowed boat strategy, and cracking down on that, preventing the CCP from pushing its own messaging on U.S. soil. Now, with that said, folks, we're again broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Also, if you want to support us, please join us on Patreon. The link is in the description below. If you haven't already, please also don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow. And if you want to go the extra mile, please tell a friend or family member about Crossroads. With that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.